Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. In a world where childhood seems to constantly be under siege, where the very essence of growing up is challenged by technology, social media, and a rapidly changing cultural landscape, one voice has remained constant for generations. That voice belongs to Judy Blume, an author who has touched the lives of millions with her honest, unflinching portrayals of childhood and adolescence. Today I'm joined by Rachel Bergstein, the author of the new book, The Genius of Judy, How Judy Blume Rewrote Childhood for All of Us. Bergstein takes us on a journey through Blume's life and work, examining how she became one of the most influential and even controversial authors of our time. As we faced renewed challenges to intellectual freedom and the right to read, Blume's story is more relevant than ever. Blume dared to tell the truth about growing up, and in doing so changed the landscape of children's literature. Rachel Bergstein is a lifestyle writer, author, and editor focused on style, pop culture, and families. Her work has appeared in the New York Post, the New York Times, and NPR. She is the author of 3 previous books, and it is my pleasure to welcome her here to talk about The Genius of Judy, How Judy Blume Rewrote Childhood. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. Talk a little bit about how Blume got started in the 60s, how she came to the work that she did.
Well, it's really an interesting story because I think now that Judy Blume is so ubiquitous and so revered, it's hard to imagine that she struggled to get her start in writing books, but struggle she did. She started writing in the late 1960s, and she was a regular suburban housewife, mother of 2, looking for something to do creatively. She had been a very creative child, and she wanted something to keep her mind occupied now that her kids were back in school. So she didn't actually start writing books. She tried various creative endeavors. She thought for a minute she might want to be a songwriter until she realized that wasn't really her gift. She did arts and crafts. She created felt banners that she actually placed and sold in Bloomingdale's for a little while. But like many of us who have children, she loved reading to her kids. And at some point she thought to herself, wow, maybe I could do this. And she experimented with a lot of different forms. She wrote for kids. She wrote picture books until she realized she didn't really have a talent for drawing. She took a class at NYU, which was her alma mater, called Writing Books for Children. And eventually she realized through the instruction of a beloved teacher that her gift was writing realistic fiction for children.
What did she touch upon that drew in such enthusiasm, such tremendous response? What was it that she brought to this?
Well, it was a few things. When Judy Blume started writing, there were some really wonderful books for children and for preteen children out there. I'm thinking of books by Roald Dahl. I'm thinking of A Wrinkle in Time. I'm thinking of the Beverly Cleary books. But there was a tradition in children's literature that books for kids always had to have some kind of moral, right? That children should be learning while they read, and that parents in children's literature are always more or less right. Children are going to struggle and they're going to experience life's challenges, but their parents are going to be there to, push them on the right path. And Judy diverged a little bit from this. She did not instill a really clear morality in her books. And she also touched upon topics that had previously been really verboten in children's books, or really any books. She talked about puberty. She talked about menstruation. She talked about sexuality. And all of these things in the 1970s, they were starting to be a greater part of the zeitgeist, but they certainly weren't in books for children.
Talk a little bit about the way in which her influence spread, the way that the number of readers that she had really began to respond to her work, and it became a kind of cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, so Judy's books, to use a very 21st century word, they kind of went viral after they went into paperback. So she was initially published in hardcover, and she found an audience of kids who really enjoyed her books. But it wasn't until she got a paperback deal with Dell that her popularity really exploded. At that point, her books were found in drugstores. Kids could go with their allowance money and buy Judy Blume books. And this, it altered the course of her career from someone who was respected and interesting and writing kind of new cutting edge things for kids to someone who was, a cultural supernova eventually. Um, her paperbacks were so beloved that there was almost like an underground way of passing them between young kids. One child would buy one and then they'd pass it to their friends. So that's really, this is in the early 80s that Judy Blume's popularity really went to the next level.
What was the reaction among parents to her work?
It was complicated. Um, some parents would say, I don't care what my kids are reading as long as they're reading books, right? That I would like to encourage my child to read, and whatever that they are drawn to, that's okay with me. Some parents, maybe more progressive parents, thought, I love that Judy Blume is teaching my young daughter about menstruation. I think it's wonderful that she's normalizing these conversations in our home. But then there were a big portion of parents, as you can imagine, who were not so keen on her. And it was for a number of reasons. Some of them had ideological problems with what she was writing about. So, for instance, she published a book called Forever in 1975 that was about two teenagers losing their virginity to each other and not suffering any serious consequences, which was groundbreaking. And this created a lot of upset around families who felt that premarital sex was wrong and stop, and that if it was going to be portrayed in a book, then there needed to be some kind of dire thing that happened to these kids. There were also parents out there who maybe had a less moralistic take on her books, but felt like they were junky. Felt like kids, if they were going to be reading, would be better off spending their time reading classics, reading things that they could learn from, and that Judy Blume's books weren't that.
When did her books begin to become banned in certain places?
So it's really interesting. It was really around the early 80s that Judy's books started being challenged and banned. Um, Judy wrote the majority of her most famous and controversial books in the 1970s. She wrote Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret in 1970. She wrote Deanie, which discusses masturbation in 1973. She wrote Forever, which I just spoke about in 1975. And there wasn't really much of an uproar in response to these books until a conservative movement really took over the tide in this country. Um, you know, a clear demarcation is the Reagan inauguration in 1981. Judy Blume has said that that was a very clear moment when things changed for her. Groups like the Moral Majority started springing up. Phyllis Schlafly, the notorious anti-feminist, started the Eagle Forum, and she actually circulated a pamphlet called How to Rid Your School of Judy Blume's Books. So, yes, there was a strong grassroots movement that was emboldened by a very conservative presidency that started to react to Judy Blume's books being carried in school libraries.
Did Judy herself realize that she became this kind of cultural touchstone in the culture wars, that it really was one of the earliest?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was a time in this country in the mid 80s when she was the most banned author in America. And it was very tough on her psychologically, as you can imagine. She's gone from someone who is celebrated for her work to someone who's being called a secular humanist, which was what someone was termed who was anti-religion in those days. But a pornographer, someone who was leading children down the wrong path. Her personal life was under attack. She was divorced twice, and some conservative pundits thought that she, just by living her life, was setting a poor example for children. So yes, it really affected her, and she was very much aware.
And how did that affect her work?
Well, she was very brave about it. I think that she took a pretty defiant stance and said, I'm going to write what I write and I'm going to stand up for what I believe in. But she did get pushback from her editor, which is really interesting. She had a long-time relationship with an editor named Dick Jackson, and they were really creative soulmates. The stories about them working together are really beautiful, that they would sit in his office for hours, with the windows open and the air coming in, and they would sit with her draft manuscripts and write in the margin with pencils. And, they had a very creatively fulfilling experience together. And he published her most famous books. But in 1981, she was set to publish a book called Tiger Eyes, which is about a young girl named Davy, who I believe she's in high school and she's lost her father in a really terrifying way. He was murdered working as a behind the counter at his 7-Eleven. And in that book, Judy had included a scene where the title character, Davy, she masturbates. She's had a really difficult time adjusting. The family has moved to New Mexico, which has been culture shock for her. She's obviously deeply grieving her father. And that moment, which is just a paragraph, it shows her kind of releasing some of the tension, literally, that she's been carrying around and letting herself experience emotion again. And her editor asked her to cut it, which he had never done before. She had sexually explicit passages in many of her books. And he said to her over one of those long, wonderful meetings, I think you should cut this out because this is a different political climate now. You want your book to reach as many children as possible. And if you include this passage, there's going to be pushback, there's going to be an uproar, and it's going to be a problem for you. And she relented, which she later said she really regretted, actually, that she, quote unquote, caved to the censors by doing that, and that she wished she hadn't.
As the audience became more sophisticated, as adolescents became more grown up over the arc of her career, how did she respond to that, and how did that impact the perception of her work?
That's a good question. I mean, Judy always felt that children are wonderful arbiters of what's appropriate for them. So in the late 1970s, Judy published her first book for adults called Wifey. And Wifey is a book about a frustrated housewife who starts cheating on her husband and has a series of kind of wild sexual escapades. And she published it under her own name, which some people disagreed with. They thought if Judy Blume was going to write something like this, she should use a pen name so that children don't accidentally pick it up. And what Judy Blume always said in response to things like that was, children read what they're ready to read. They have an instinctive understanding of what they are prepared to absorb. So if they pick up a book that's inappropriate for them, they're going to realize that very quickly and put it down. They're going to lose interest. Unlike what you see in a movie, the images in books, you fill them in with what exists in your imagination. So if a child picks up a book that they don't have any touchstone for what's going on, they might just toss it aside because it's boring. So Judy never adapted her work because her name might attract young readers. She wrote for readers of different ages, from very young readers, when you think of the Fudge series, to her adult books, which are sexually explicit. And she felt that the audience would be self-selecting.
Was she naive about that? Was she naive about the cultural changes that were taking place?
I think she might have been at first, but I think she quickly, as she became a target, started to recognize what was going on. She hooked up with an organization called the National Coalition Against Censorship. And that, she says, really changed the trajectory of how she felt about being censored, because it gave her the tools to push back. So, when a high school is saying they want to take her book forever off the shelves, after she was connected with the National Coalition Against Censorship, she was able to direct the people who worked there towards that high school and work on getting the book restored. So I don't think that she was naive. I think that she was being an artist who wrote what she wanted to write and then had to adapt to figure out how to defend her work at a time when books were asking to be defended.
How much time, how much effort did she spend on trying to fight this censorship of her work?
Oh my goodness, a lot. I mean, this has been one of Judy Blume's greatest legacies. And I think it's why her name comes up so often now, because we're seeing a new wave of book bans in this country. She was a pioneer against book censorship, and she continues to lend her name to various organizations and lawsuits that are against book removals and book challenges. And yeah, it's become a big part of her career and her legacy.
How does she see her work in the context of the way adolescence has evolved today?
Well, I'm not sure how she sees it, but I can tell you how I see it, which is that Judy Blume has had tremendous impact on the way that adolescence has evolved. You know, when Judy was growing up in the 1950s, the idea of a teenager was even relatively new. You know, teenagerdom was really a post World War II phenomenon. Um, this country was experiencing an economic boom like it had never seen before. Families of four or five could get by on one income, and kids didn't have to go to work right out of, middle school, right? Like they didn't have to contribute to the family coffers. So um they were experiencing more leisure and more social time than kids their age had ever before in this country. And so Judy starts writing books in the late 1960s when that idea of the adolescent, of the preteen, is still evolving, right? And what she does in her books is she introduces readers, or she brings readers along into a world that's just created by these young people, worlds that have rules like what kind of socks you can wear and who you're allowed to have a crush on and who you're not allowed to have a crush on, who you're feuding with on the school bus and who you're not. I mean, this stuff sounds very superficial, but then her books are very layered. So within these stories that draw kids in, there are stories about really serious things that the protagonists are worried about. Like Margaret is thinking a lot about religion and her relationship to God, and the fact that she isn't growing up with religion because her Christian grandparents rejected her Jewish father. We see the protagonist, Tony, in the book, Then Again, Maybe I Won't. Yes, he's experiencing physical changes and, spying on his attractive teenage neighbor as she gets changed, but he's also grappling with the fact that his family has experienced incredible economic mobility over a year, and he doesn't like the way that they're behaving with all of their new money. Um, Judy Blume wrote about divorce in a way that children's books authors had never done before. She has a book called It's Not the End of the World, which was published in 1973. And it's about a family experiencing divorce. And it's told through a child's eyes watching her parents break up. And it's incredibly heartbreaking, but it's also meant to be reassuring to a young reader whose parents were going through that, which, of course, at that time in 1973 was becoming more and more common.
To what extent was she shaping the culture versus reflecting the culture of the moments that she was writing?
That's a really good question. And I do think it's a mixture of both. I mean, in my book, I argue that part of Judy's genius is that she was absorbing the messages of second wave feminism and that she was putting them into her books in real time and introducing them to young readers. So, in that way, I think she really had huge impact on the culture. She was not a feminist marching in New York City or quote unquote burning her bra. She was a woman who was living a life that she thought that she had chosen and realizing she wasn't happy. Um, and at that time in her life, she was being exposed to feminist writing and feminist thought. So books like The Feminist Mystique. She's seeing Susan Brown Miller go on television and debate Hugh Hefner. And she is putting feminist messages into her books in a way that I think truly helped ensure the longevity of the feminist movement among the next generation.
How did the feminist movement at the time perceive her and her work?
I don't know that they paid a ton of attention to her and her work, to be honest. And I think part of my mission with this book is to put her in her proper place as a real feminist icon. I don't know that we always think of Judy Blume that way, but I think she deserves to be thought of that way. Like I said, she wasn't out there with the National Organization of Women. She wasn't out there with Betty Friedan. She wasn't on the cover of Time magazine like Kate Millett. But she was doing something equally important. When I was reading feminist texts for this book, books like The Feminine Mystique, books like Sexual Politics, I noticed a theme, which was that the second wave feminists said it was really a shame that the suffragettes, who were the first wave of feminists, they kind of collapsed in a in exhaustion after they won the thing they were fighting for, which was the vote in America. That after they got what they wanted, the feminist movement kind of fell apart because they were so tired and there weren't younger women and girls out there to take up the mantle. So I believe what Judy Blume did with her books is she trained the next generation of feminists so that when the second wave feminists got tired, they got burnt out, there would be a new generation to move into their place.
And talk about the relevance of her work today, particularly among young people in an age of social media.
Well, I don't know that Judy Blume is read as frequently as she was when I was growing up in the 80s, for instance. I mean, I think that there are an incredible array of really interesting, complicated books for kids to choose from now. So if Judy was a pioneer in this space, like her legacy in part is the incredible writers who are writing about sexuality, who are writing about puberty, who are writing about real life issues for children. But Judy is still what I call in my book, kind of half jokingly, the grande dame of dirty books, and her name does get invoked. I was just listening to a podcast this morning from NPR where it's a new podcast about the book banning crisis, and Judy Blume's name came up within the first 3 minutes, So I think that she's become a shorthand for the left in particular as someone that we can really look to for writing incredibly complex books for children and for defending the rights of those children to read them. She also, she still has a legacy among the right, and this started in the 1980s as a shorthand for something else, something worse, someone who's out to corrupt our kids. And so while, Judy's books aren't necessarily the ones that are always being banned now, she still represents a divisive figure in reading and in libraries.
What is your sense of how she sees that legacy today? That the legacy is not necessarily the work, although that's certainly part of it, and how it was perceived by its audience, but really this legacy of fighting against censorship?
I think she's very proud of that legacy. I would say that she sees herself as a champion of free speech and that she comments on issues of censorship at any chance she can. She's been very vocal. Judy Blume is now 86, and she's still out there being very vocal that censorship is a very scary thing in this country, and that it has actually changed a lot since she was defending herself in the 1980s. Like I said before, in the 80s, this was a grassroots movement against books pioneered by, groups like the Moral Majority. Now politicians are getting involved and they're putting laws on the books that make it really difficult for teachers to teach certain titles in certain areas, for libraries to carry certain titles in certain areas. And Judy is incredibly clear that she thinks this is a really scary thing.
How did teachers perceive her work?
I would say teachers almost universally admire Judy Blume. Judy has written very digestible literature for children that tackles serious issues. And I think teachers are so appreciative of that. She has made impact on generations of young readers, and not just girls, boys too. And that's no easy feat. So teachers, I think, really admire Judy Blume.
Talk about the aspect of boys, because when one thinks of Judy Blume and her audience, it is primarily girls, young women. Talk a little bit about how she imagined boys reading her work.
Well, some of her best-selling titles are her titles for the younger side of her readership, which are the Fudge books, starting with Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, which those books start a set of boy siblings. She based the character of Fudge, who, if you're not familiar, is a wild toddler who is silly and hilarious to kids and is always getting himself in trouble. She based that character on her own son, Larry. So, many men I speak to say they loved the Fudge books too, and that they didn't necessarily read Judy Blume's entire oeuvre. They weren't necessarily compelled to pick up Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, but they loved the Fudge books. I have a son myself, and as part of my research for this book, I delightfully read those Fudge books with him, and he was enamored. I mean, he was laughing out loud in the places that I remember laughing out loud as a kid. And what more proof of staying power is there, right?
Rachel Bergstein, the book is The Genius of Judy, How Judy Blume Rewrote Childhood for All of Us. Rachel, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.